Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Ariqah and today I'm going to explain about the history of English literature. Here I have several periods that I'm going to explain for you today, so let's check it out. The first era is 18th century. 18th century is a famous era where Newton declared that the universe could not have arisen out of the chaos by mere laws of nature. Such a wonderful uniformity of the planetary system had to the handiwork of an intelligent and benevolent creator. 18th century poetry has been associated not only with the neoclassicism, with the attempt to create the polish and revival of ancient Greek and Latin. Here we have three famous authors. The first one is Jonathan Swift. Famous work is Travel to the Several Nations of the World, or also known as Gulliver's Travels, about the Lemuel Gulliver, an English surgeon who rises to be a ship captain. The second author is Alexander Pope. The most sustained narrative satires, that is the Rape of the Lock, expanded and undercutting of the dire offense, with a rose from trivial things, takes on the weight of a criticism of the manners of aristocratic society as observed by an amused friend. And the third author is Daniel Defoe. His famous work is Robinson Crusoe, probably his 412th work that have perfected an impression of realism by adapting Puritan self-confession narratives to sweet the mud of fictional moral tracts, but he would in no sense have seen that he was pioneering a new art. The second period is Romantic period. This era, also known as the Age of Revolution. The main point of the period is French Revolution, with a great deal of the subsequent vocabulary of liberal politics right through the present day, deriving from the French experience between 1789 and 1799. Based on Pack Uncoil in a book, A Brief History of English Literature, they assume that the works in this era are most likely to focus on the concept of an idea of freedom associated with the nature that sets against the mire of this. The three famous authors here, I have the first one is Mary Shelley. Her photos in fiction Frankenstein built a philosophy on nature, on the origins of meaning of the life, and on the myth of Prometheus, and on the enterprise of the modern sciences. The second is William Wordsworth. His poem is The Prelude. Records the growth of poet's mind, and it also attempt to shape the certain crucial descendant in a poet's life into the ideal pattern of self and representation. And the third one is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. His memorable contribution to lyrical ballads that collaborate with Wordsworth is the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Okay, the next period here we have the High Victorian period. After the Queen Victoria succeeded her uncle William IV as a sovereign of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in 1837, the period around that year was one of the unprecedented change, as an agricultural country was transformed to an industrial country. The very appearance of the landscape was changed by the railways, a physical alteration that also affected how the people saw and related to each other. In early 1830s, a new sense existed of being an individual and having to fend for oneself in the urban world. In the first half of the 19th century, Britain experienced unprecedented economic and social change. All the various forces seemingly to build a climax around 1847 and 1848. The novels that appeared at this time are the response to the social development. The famous works of this era, here we have the first one is Charles Dickens. His work is Oliver Twist or The Parish Boys Progress in 1837 until 1878. And then we have Charlotte and Emily Bronte. Charlotte with her work The Jane Eyre, and also Emily with her work The Wuthering Heights. Next, we have the late Victorian period. After Queen Victoria embodied the matronly uprightness that regained until January 1901, and the last years of her reign appeared to patriotic observed to mark the apogee of the national and imperial glory. Victorian values, beliefs, and standards of personal and social behavior were already being challenged, sometimes angrily, by the new generation of intellectuals and writers. The literature of the last 20 years of the century engages in an extended and various discourse with which attempt to reevaluate the assumption of the 1850s and 1860s and to work out the implications of the new concept of the liberation and evolutionary development. If the writers of the first two-thirds of the century can be seen as struggling to come to terms with a multiplicity of impression, convictions, facts, beliefs, and unbeliefs, their immediate successor reworked ideas and sought parallels, analogues, or images that contemporary scientific thought. They also agonized over describing new concepts. The famous authors of this era, here we have two famous authors. The first one is Mary Augusta Ward, with her work is Robert Elsmere in 1888. The second one is William Hale White. White's the Revolution of 10 Years Lane in 1887. Moves beyond the individual clerical job to the border proletarian world of the articulate artisan and the dissenting tradesman. The next period we have the Edwardian period. Here, to some nostalgic observers, the short reign of King Edward VII seemed like an autumnal idyll in an era of international peace, internal security, and relative prosperity. Perhaps the most urgent political question of the Edwardian years was that of the women's suffrage. The Women's Social and Political Union was formed in 1903, and between 1906 and 1914, the union undertook increasingly militant action and to further its cause. In the mainstream English fiction in early 90s, the religious dub of the preceding 20 years and the reaction against Victorian repression and the social or familial oppression are gradually marginalized. Pervasive desire to articulate the unsaid and to give the voice to formerly silent social groups, to women above all, and also to often conventional, generally ignored petty bourgeois. There are two famous authors. The first one is Wells. By his work The New Machiavelli, there were hordes of men in the modern industrial world who set the raised themselves up from the general mass of untrained, uncultured, poorish people in a hard through selfish struggle. And the second author is Mary Sinclair with her work Mary Olivier, Alive. a novel which traces the expanding consciousness of a middle-class girl, the youngest child of a family. Next, we have the Modernism period. Here, the International General Strike, once seen as the socialism trump card to be played against a warmongering ruling class, failed to materialize in 1914, and Labour MPs were chosen to serve both in Lloyd George War cabinet and in the minor governmental post. The cause of women's suffrage, so actively pursued in the year up to 1914, was effectively silenced by the promise of future electoral reform, that is, a promise of that partly redeemed in 1919. The works reflected the changing social, political, and cultural climate. They are diverse, experiment, and non-traditional. Um, Also, the objectivity is no longer possible, and omniscient narrative is no longer appropriate either. Most of the perspective and subjectivity become the central. The writers use the figural narrative perspective, interior monologue, and the stream of consciousness are central narrative techniques, and also this era was famous with the radically physiology. There are two famous authors of this period. Those are Leighton Strachey, the prime Bloomsbury text. Leighton Strachey's and eminent Victorians suggest that it is easier to see what the group did not represent than what it did. The second author is Virginia Woolf. Her fictional style developed beyond the relatively conventional parameters of the voyage out to the experimental representation of the consciousness in Mr. Dallamy, and to the lighthouse and the waves. Specific characterization receipts and the detailed exploration of the individual identity tends to melt into a larger and freer. Next, we have the 20th century period. The Iron Curtain divided the world politically into communist and non-communist. The United States of America, which had entered the First World War in 1916, entered the Second World War in the late 1941, and being on the winning side each time, helped it become the dominant economic and cultural force in the world, position which was strengthened by the fall of communist regimes in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The literary imagination has charted the most recent times with no lack of inventiveness and imagination. In spite of the growth of the medium, more books are now being published than ever before, and more books are being read than ever before. It is possible to say which of today's writer will be considered important than 100 years. Famous authors in this period. The first one we have Eliot with the Cocktail Party. The second one is Tony Harrison's with The Gaze of the Gorgon. The third one we have Milne that with the work Winnie the Pooh and The House of Pooh Corner. In the 21st century period, the defining event of the first part of the 21st century was the attack on American targets, including the Twin Towers in New York on September. The attacks that had a huge impact in ever since, emotionally, culturally, politically, and all over the world. Imaginative responsive to it went through stages of shock, grief, and anger and assimilation, and then also the economic crash of wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the war on terror have all contributed to the created to create particular atmosphere of the early years of the 21st century. The major characteristic of this era is about women's writing. Uh, Even though it is in the previous era, women already have their own right to create literary works, but in this era, many of the major writers of our time happen to be women, just as many happen to be gay or born outside the Great Britain, or whatever else might distinguish the empire. Three famous authors of this era. The first one is Doris Lessing. The second one is Seamus Heaney, and the third one is David Hare. Okay, before I close my explanation, here I want to conclude about the lesson that I already learned from all of these era. That after reading and understanding the periods and every characteristics that shows in each specific aspects and lesson that we can get from it, we learn about the language itself that also keeps changing along each periods and the savors of the society and the environment. Every movement that intended to fight and give the opportunity to every human being to have their own rights and in order to express their thought. In the literature's perspective, and also as the reflection of the society, can give more opportunity to the writers to express what they think of the word itself. By reading and watching the literary works, we can see the differences between the one period to another that maybe from our own perspective can be something that is either bad or good for our society nowadays. But it is all part of the lesson, so that we can learn something new by reading through the past. I think that's all that I can deliver for you today. Thank you so much for watching my videos, and I see you guys for the next video. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi